October 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Stonehurst, New Jersey, carrying 54 women who had learned to forget what hunger felt like because acknowledging it made the emptiness worse. Waltraud Lehmann sat near the back, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform hanging loose on a frame that had once been sturdy and capable. She was 26 years old, though the hollows beneath her cheekbones made her look a decade older. Around her, the other women maintained the same rigid silence they had kept since their capture in France 3 weeks earlier. They had been radio operators, clerks, nurses, and translators for the German military. Now they were simply prisoners, enemy aliens on American soil, waiting to discover what fate their captors had designed for them. The truck stopped with a mechanical groan. Waltraud watched through the canvas opening as American soldiers, both men and women, moved about the compound with an ease that struck her as almost obscene. They weren't starving. Their uniforms fit properly. Some of them were actually smiling as they worked, as if the war were merely an inconvenience rather than the all-consuming catastrophe that had devoured Europe. Major Constance Fairchild stood waiting as the German women climbed down from the truck. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had overseen 3 other POW processing operations, but this was her first group of female prisoners. The intelligence reports had been sparse. German Women's Auxiliary Corps members captured during the Allied advance. Non-combatants technically, though the distinction felt meaningless when the entire continent was ablaze. What struck Major Fairchild immediately was not their appearance, though they looked gaunt and exhausted, but their eyes. These women looked at the camp with the flat, affectless gaze of people who had stopped expecting anything beyond the next moment of endurance. She had seen that look before on refugees, on displaced persons, on soldiers who had witnessed too much. But she had never seen it on prisoners who were about to be fed, housed, and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Private Delmar Hutchinson, a lanky 22-year-old from Vermont, helped the women form a line for initial processing. He had been assigned to Camp Stonehurst for 7 months and had processed hundreds of male German POWs. But watching these women shuffle into formation, he felt something shift in his understanding of what this war had done to people. His younger sister was about the same age as many of these prisoners. He found himself wondering what circumstances would have to exist for Rebecca to look this hollowed out, this defeated. The processing took 2 hours. Names recorded, personal effects cataloged, medical examinations completed. Then, Major Fairchild led them to the mess hall for their first meal as official prisoners of war. The women walked in formation, maintaining military discipline even in captivity. But when they entered the dining facility and saw the tables laid out with white bread, butter, cheese, canned meat, and coffee with real cream, something in their collective composure began to crack. Waltraud stared at the food as if it were a mirage. Major Constance Fairchild had witnessed many reactions from prisoners receiving their first American meal. Usually there was visible relief, sometimes gratitude, occasionally suspicion that the food might be poisoned or that this abundance was temporary, designed to elicit information before rations would be reduced. But she had never seen this, a collective paralysis so complete that 54 women simply stood at their tables, staring at bread and butter as if they were hallucinating. Hildegard Steiner, a former nursing assistant from Munich, reached out with a trembling hand to touch the butter. Her fingers made contact with the small pad on her plate, and she jerked back as if burned. It was real. It was actually real butter, not the ersatz fat made from coal tar that had been standard in Germany for the past 2 years. Beside her, Christa Wolf picked up a slice of white bread and held it to her nose, inhaling deeply. She had not seen white flour bread since 1942. In Germany, bread had become progressively darker as the blockades tightened, as wheat became scarce, as sawdust and chestnuts were mixed into the flour to extend supplies. This bread was impossibly white, impossibly soft, impossibly present. Major Fairchild exchanged a glance with Private Hutchinson, who stood near the doorway. His expression mirrored her own confusion. These women weren't reacting to a feast. They were reacting to ordinary rations, the same food that American soldiers complained about as being monotonous and uninspiring. What kind of deprivation had they experienced to make standard military provisions seem like luxury? She cleared her throat and spoke in careful German, one of 3 languages she had studied at Radcliffe before the war. "Please, sit and eat. This is your meal. No one will take it from you." The words seemed to break the spell. Slowly, the women lowered themselves onto the benches. But even seated, many continued to stare at their plates as if the food might vanish if they looked away. Waltraud forced herself to pick up the bread. Her hands shook as she brought it to her mouth. The first bite released a flood of sense memory so powerful that she had to close her eyes. Softness, sweetness from the wheat itself, the yielding texture of properly risen dough. She had forgotten that bread could taste like this, that food could be something other than merely functional fuel for a body that was slowly consuming itself. Around her, other women were experiencing similar moments of recognition and grief. Lotta Schreiber, who had not cried since her capture, found tears streaming down her face as she chewed. The butter melted on her tongue, and with it came the memory of her grandmother's kitchen in Stuttgart, of Sunday morning breakfasts before the war, of a world where such abundance was ordinary and unremarkable. Private Hutchinson watched a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes try to spread butter on her bread with movements so careful, so reverent, that it looked like a religious ritual. She was rationing even this plenty, spreading the butter thin as if there might not be more tomorrow. He had grown up on a dairy farm where butter was as common as air. His mother had sent him overseas with complaints about wartime rationing, about having to make do with less sugar and meat. But these women, these enemy women, looked at butter the way his sister looked at her most precious possessions. Bernadette Callahan had been cooking for the United States Army for 3 years, ever since her husband shipped out to the Pacific, and she needed work that felt like contribution rather than waiting. She ran the Camp Stonehurst kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had fed a family of 7 back in Boston, and saw no reason why feeding 200 soldiers should be any more complicated. She had cooked for male German POWs before, treating them with the same practical neutrality she brought to everything. They were hungry, she had food, and politics didn't belong in her kitchen. But the female prisoners unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. When she watched them eat that first meal, moving so carefully, so reverently, with food that her own children would have complained about, something shifted in her understanding. These weren't soldiers. These were women who had forgotten what plenty looked like. Thanksgiving was approaching, and Bernadette had already begun planning the menu. Turkey, of course, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, and rolls. Standard holiday fare for the American soldiers stationed at Stonehurst. But she found herself thinking about those German women, about the way they had stared at white bread as if it were treasure. She made her decision on a Tuesday morning while reviewing her supplies. She would bake a chocolate layer cake, a real one, with proper cocoa powder, real sugar, real butter, and thick chocolate frosting, not because anyone had ordered it, not because it was required, but because something in her believed these women needed to taste sweetness again. Major Fairchild raised an eyebrow when Bernadette submitted her Thanksgiving menu. A chocolate cake for the German prisoners? The Major's tone wasn't judgmental, merely curious. Bernadette wiped her hands on her apron, meeting the Major's gaze with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own mind. "Ma'am, I've seen starving people before. My family came from Ireland during the famine years. My grandmother told stories about forgetting what sugar tasted like, about how that forgetting changes something in a person. Those women in there, they have that same look." Major Fairchild considered this. "You think a cake will help?" Bernadette shrugged. "I think remembering that sweetness exists might help. Can't hurt, anyway." Permission was granted. For the next week, Bernadette planned her baking with the precision of a military operation. She requisitioned the finest cocoa powder, real vanilla extract, extra sugar for the frosting. She would make 3 large cakes, enough that every woman could have a proper slice. Private Hutchinson, who had been assigned to assist in the kitchen, watched her work with growing curiosity. "Miss Callahan, why go to all this trouble for prisoners?" Bernadette paused in her measuring, considering her answer. "Because somebody needs to show them that not everything they were told about America was a lie, and because chocolate cake is a language everyone understands." Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. The November sky stretched pale above Camp Stonehurst. The German women had been told there would be a special meal, though none of them understood what the American holiday meant, or why their captors would include prisoners in any celebration. They filed into the mess hall with the same cautious uncertainty they brought to everything, still not quite believing that yesterday's food would be repeated today, that this abundance wasn't temporary or conditional. The tables had been arranged differently. Instead of the usual utilitarian rows, they formed a large rectangle that allowed everyone to see one another. Major Fairchild stood at the head of the room, and for the first time since their arrival, she smiled at them. "Today is Thanksgiving," she said in her careful German. "It's a day when Americans gather to share a meal and acknowledge what we're grateful for. You're part of this camp, so you're part of this meal." The food came out in waves. Turkey, actually roasted turkey with crispy skin and tender meat, mashed potatoes so buttery they glistened, gravy that smelled like comfort itself, green beans rolled still warm from the oven, cranberry sauce gleaming like jewels. Waltraud watched each dish arrive with mounting disbelief. This wasn't prisoner rations. This was abundance on a scale she hadn't witnessed since before the war consumed everything. The women ate slowly, reverently, many of them crying quietly as they chewed. Hildegard kept touching the turkey on her plate as if to confirm its reality. Krista folded her dinner roll in half and simply held it, unable to bring herself to consume something so precious. Then Bernadette Callahan emerged from the kitchen carrying the first cake. It was magnificent, 3 layers of deep chocolate with frosting so thick and glossy it looked like silk. She placed it on the center table, then returned with 2 more identical cakes. The room fell absolutely silent. 54 German women stared at 3 chocolate layer cakes as if they were staring at impossible artifacts from a lost civilization. Lotta Schreiber made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Several women began shaking their heads in unconscious denial, unable to process what they were seeing. "This is chocolate cake," Major Fairchild said unnecessarily, because everyone knew what it was. They simply couldn't believe it existed. "There's enough for everyone to have a piece." Bernadette began cutting slices, large, generous wedges that she placed on small plates. Private Hutchinson helped distribute them, moving around the table with quiet efficiency. When he placed a slice in front of Waltraud, she looked up at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't gratitude exactly, it was something closer to grief, to the terrible understanding that everything she had believed about scarcity and enemies and the nature of the world had just been overturned by chocolate cake. Hildegard Steiner had not allowed herself to cry since the moment of her capture. She had maintained rigid control through interrogations, through the humiliation of surrendering her auxiliary corps insignia, through the Atlantic crossing in the cargo hold of a military transport ship. She had watched her country collapse, had seen cities burning, had lost contact with her family in Munich, and through all of it, she had kept her face carefully blank, her emotions locked behind the discipline that her service had demanded. But now she sat with a plate holding a slice of chocolate layer cake, and something in her chest was breaking open. Her fork trembled as she cut through the layers. The cake was moist, impossibly rich, with frosting that seemed too decadent to exist in a world at war. She brought the first bite to her mouth, and the taste detonated every defense she had constructed. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful in its intensity. Sugar. Real sugar, not saccharin, not the chemical substitutes that had become standard in Germany. Real cocoa, real butter, real vanilla. The flavors she had trained herself to forget came flooding back with such force that her entire body began to shake. The tears came suddenly, violently, years of suppressed emotion pouring out over a piece of cake. She tried to stop, mortified by her loss of control, but her body had decided it was done with restraint. She sobbed into her hands while the chocolate cake sat untouched before her, the physical evidence that everything she had sacrificed for had been built on deprivation while their enemies had possessed abundance all along. Around her, the dam broke for others as well. Christa Wolf was crying silent tears that streamed down her face, unchecked. Lotta Schreiber had her head in her arms, shoulders shaking. Within moments, nearly half the women in the mess hall were weeping, and the sound was devastating. Not the polite sniffling of momentary emotion, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the core of who they were. Major Fairchild stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this collective breakdown. She had expected pleasure, perhaps surprise, but not this tsunami of grief disguised as gratitude. Private Hutchinson looked at Bernadette with alarm, as if her cake had poisoned them. But the cook shook her head slowly. She understood. This wasn't about the cake itself. This was about what the cake represented. Every woman in this room had been told that America was suffering, that the enemy was desperate, that Germany's sacrifices were necessary because everyone was equally deprived. The chocolate cake was proof that they had been lied to about everything. Waltraud reached across the table and took Hildegard's hand. The two women sat connected, both crying, both holding pieces of cake they could barely bring themselves to eat. The sweetness in their mouths tasted like truth. And truth, after years of propaganda, was almost impossible to swallow. But they tried. Bite by bite, through tears, they tried. Waltraud Lehmann lay awake that night in her barracks bunk, staring at the ceiling, while her mind performed calculations that didn't make sense. If the Americans had chocolate cake, real chocolate with real sugar, and real butter, then what else had been a lie? The propaganda had been consistent, relentless, woven into every aspect of daily life in Germany. The enemy was starving, they were told. The British blockade had crippled American supply lines. The Allies were desperate, on the verge of collapse, rationing everything down to the last crumb, while German industry remained strong and productive. But she had watched Bernadette Callahan cut those cakes with the casual ease of someone for whom such abundance was ordinary. She had seen the American soldiers eating the same food, treating it as routine rather than special. This wasn't a propaganda display designed to demoralize prisoners. This was simply Thursday in an American military camp. Around her in the darkness, she could hear other women breathing, some sleeping, others clearly awake and wrestling with the same impossible reconciliation. Christa Wolf's voice came soft from the bunk below. "Waltraud, are you awake?" She didn't want to answer, didn't want to speak the thoughts forming in her mind, but the words came anyway. "Yes, the cake," Christa whispered. "That wasn't special for us, was it? That's just what they have." Waltraud closed her eyes. "I think so." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. If the Americans had chocolate cake while German citizens ate bread mixed with sawdust, if their prisoners ate better than German soldiers in the field, then what did that say about everything they had been told? What did it say about the sacrifices they had made, the deprivations they had endured, the certainty they had carried that their suffering was shared and necessary? Lotta Schreiber spoke from across the room, her voice tight with something between anger and despair. "My mother wrote me in 1943 that my baby sister died. She was 6 years old. The doctor said malnutrition, but Mother called it the hunger." Her breath hitched. "She died because there wasn't enough food, and these people, these enemies, they have chocolate cake." Waltraud felt something cold settling in her chest. How many German children had died while their government assured everyone that the enemy was equally desperate? How many families had buried loved ones who starved while being told that sacrifice was patriotic, that everyone was suffering together, that victory was near? Hildegard's voice came from the darkness, barely audible. What else did they lie about? The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered, because everyone knew that once you started pulling at one thread of deception, the entire fabric began to unravel. If they had lied about American scarcity, what about American cruelty? What about the righteousness of Germany's cause? What about everything that had given their service meaning? The chocolate cake had been sweet, but the truth it represented was bitter enough to choke on. The morning after Thanksgiving, Krista Wolf approached Major Fairchild during the daily work assignment announcements. Her English was halting, but determined. "Please, Major, I wish to work in kitchen. I want to learn." Major Fairchild studied the young woman's face, seeing something that looked like hunger but wasn't about food. "Why the kitchen specifically?" Krista struggled for the English words, finally switching to German. "I need to understand. I need to see how this is possible." Within a week, 7 German prisoners had volunteered for kitchen duty. Bernadette Callahan found herself with more help than she needed, but something in their earnest faces made her accept them all. They arrived each morning at 5 o'clock, watching everything she did with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When she pulled 50-pound sacks of flour from the storage room, Waltraud actually gasped. "This much flour? Just here? Just available?" Bernadette paused, a scoop in her hand, seeing her kitchen through their eyes for the first time. "Well, yes, we go through about 6 sacks a week, sometimes more." She watched Waltraud's face go pale. The German woman reached out and touched the burlap sack as if it were holy. In Germany, she had waited in lines for hours to receive a single pound of flour mixed with potato starch and ground peas. The sugar was worse. When Bernadette opened the industrial-sized container holding pure, white granulated sugar, Hildegard made a sound like a wounded animal. "So much," she whispered in German. "So much. And we were told you had nothing." Bernadette scooped sugar into a measuring cup, the crystals cascading with a sound like rain. "We're rationed too," she said, though she felt foolish saying it. "We get coupons for sugar at home, can't buy as much as before the war." Lotta laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "How much is your ration?" Bernadette thought about it. "About half a pound per person per week, I think. Little less, maybe." She watched the German women exchange looks that she couldn't interpret. What Bernadette didn't know was that German civilian rations had dropped to less than 1 ounce of sugar per person per month by 1943. And by 1944, sugar had essentially disappeared from civilian life entirely. Her sacrifice represented luxury beyond their imagination. The baking lessons became something more than cooking instruction. Bernadette showed them how to cream butter and sugar, and the women watched the mixture transform with expressions of wonder. She demonstrated how to fold beaten egg whites into batter, how to test cake doneness, how to make frosting that held its shape. Simple techniques that she had learned from her mother, passed without thought, because ingredients were simply available when needed. But for these women, each lesson was a revelation and an indictment. Every cup of sugar, every stick of butter, every spoonful of real vanilla extract was evidence that their deprivation had been unnecessary. That somewhere in the machinery of war, their leaders had chosen suffering, while their enemies had maintained abundance. Lotta Schreiber sat at the small writing desk in the common area, a sheet of Red Cross stationery before her, and a pen gripped in her trembling hand. The International Red Cross facilitated mail between prisoners of war and their families, subject to censorship, but the letters were supposed to reach home eventually. She had written to her mother every week since her capture, careful letters that followed the prescribed format. "I am well. I am being treated according to Geneva Convention standards. I hope this finds you in good health." But tonight she wanted to write something different, something true. "Dear Mama," she wrote in German, "today I helped bake bread in the American kitchen. We used 50 pounds of white flour, just for one day, just for one camp. The flour was pure, Mama, no sawdust, no chestnuts, no potato starch. I wanted to weep when I touched it. She stopped reading what she had written. Her hand moved again. They have sugar here, Mama, not a little, not rationed to nothing. They have containers of it, white and pure, and they use it freely. Yesterday I watched the cook make frosting, and she used more sugar in one bowl than we had for the entire year before I left. Do you remember how Greta died? How the doctor said her body just gave up because there wasn't enough food? She was 6 years old, and she died hungry while our enemies had chocolate cake. Lotta's tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. She kept writing, the words pouring out like poison she needed to expel. They told us America was starving, that the blockades had worked, that everyone was suffering equally. But Mama, they lied. They lied about everything. These people have so much food, they complain about eating. The same things too often. Their prisoners eat better than our soldiers, better than our children. She finished the letter, signed it, and sat staring at what she had written. Then, slowly, deliberately, she picked up the paper and walked to the wood stove in the corner of the room. She fed it to the flames and watched it curl and blacken. Around her, other women were doing the same thing. Waltraud had written 3 pages describing the abundance she had witnessed, the casual plenty that characterized American military life. She burned them all. Krista had composed a letter asking her sister if their rationing had been necessary or merely a tool of control. She never sealed the envelope. Hildegard had written to her fiancé, if he still lived, trying to explain how chocolate cake had dismantled her understanding of patriotism. The letter was ash before midnight. They burned them because no one would believe what they described. They burned them because saying these things felt like betrayal, even though they were true. They burned them because the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they now witnessed was too vast to fit in a letter. But mostly, they burned them because they were beginning to understand that the real cruelty wasn't American bombs or military defeat. The real cruelty was discovering that their suffering had been unnecessary, that their sacrifices had been exploited, that children had died preventable deaths while their leaders maintained the fiction of shared deprivation. December brought news that changed everything again. Major Fairchild received reports from Europe, photographs, and testimonies from American forces liberating concentration camps. She had wrestled with whether to make this information available to the German prisoners, knowing it would shatter whatever remained of their understanding of the country they had served. But ultimately, she decided they had a right to know. The truth, however terrible, was still truth. She posted the newspaper articles in the common area without commentary, photographs from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from Buchenwald. The images were stark and horrifying. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, testimonies of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Waltraud found them first, drawn by the crowd of American soldiers reading with expressions of shock and disgust. She moved closer, her English now proficient enough to read the headlines. Her legs nearly gave out. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same Germany she had proudly served. But the photographs were dated, the locations were specific, and the testimonies came from both survivors and the American soldiers who had liberated the camps. She read about Auschwitz, about gas chambers disguised as showers, about the systematic extermination of millions. Jews, Poles, Russians, political prisoners, anyone deemed undesirable by the Reich. She read until her vision blurred, until the words stopped making sense. Hildegard found her there an hour later, still standing, still reading, tears streaming silently down her face. Waltraud? Her friend's voice sounded far away. Waltraud pointed at the photographs with a shaking hand. We did this. Our country did this. While we were eating sawdust bread and believing we were sacrificing for something honorable, our government was murdering millions. The other German women gathered slowly, drawn by some instinct that something momentous was happening. They read in silence, their faces reflecting the same progression of emotions: disbelief, denial, horror, and finally a crushing guilt that had nothing to do with personal culpability, but everything to do with collective identity. Krista sank to the floor, her back against the wall. How could we not know? How could something this massive be hidden from us? But even as she asked, she remembered the whispers, the rumors that were quickly silenced, the neighbors who disappeared and were never mentioned again. She remembered being told not to ask questions, that curiosity was unpatriotic, that trust in leadership was a virtue. Lotta spoke quietly, her voice hollow. The chocolate cake. Do you understand now? They had abundance and chose cruelty. We had nothing because they spent everything on death. The juxtaposition was almost incomprehensible. Their people had starved while resources were diverted to building camps and gas chambers. Children had died of malnutrition while the machinery of genocide consumed money, materials, and manpower. Private Hutchinson watched from across the room as the German women grappled with this knowledge. He felt an unexpected pity for them. These weren't the architects of atrocity. They were young women who had believed they were serving their country's defense, who had been kept deliberately ignorant of what their service supported. Major Fairchild appeared beside him. "It's hard to watch," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." She was silent for a moment. "But necessary. They need to understand what they were part of, even unknowingly. Only then can they choose what comes next." 20 years later, autumn sunlight filtered through the windows of a small bakery in Princeton, New Jersey. The sign above the door read, "Lehman's German Bakery," and inside, Waltraud Lehman, now an American citizen, arranged chocolate layer cakes in the display case. Her hands, no longer shaking, moved with practiced confidence. She was 46 years old, her hair touched with gray, her face settled into the lines of someone who had learned hard truths and chosen to live with them rather than run from them. A young reporter from the Princeton paper had called the previous week, asking for an interview about immigrant business owners. They sat in the small office behind the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of baking bread and sugar. "Mrs. Lehman," the reporter began, "your bakery specializes in German desserts, but I'm told your chocolate layer cake is purely American. Can you tell me about that choice?" Waltraud smiled, the expression carrying complicated memories. "That cake saved my life, not literally, but in every way that matters." She told the story carefully, describing her arrival at Camp Stonehurst as a prisoner, half-starved and certain of American cruelty. She described the abundance that had seemed impossible, and Thanksgiving. 1944, when Bernadette Callahan had baked chocolate cake for German prisoners and inadvertently dismantled an entire architecture of lies. "Until that moment," Waltraud said quietly, "I could believe our suffering was noble, that everyone was equally deprived. The cake showed me we had been lied to about everything." She explained how the revelation about concentration camps had come weeks later, how the chocolate cake had prepared her to accept that terrible truth, because she had already learned her government's words were worthless. She described the long process of moral reckoning, of learning to live with knowledge that could never be unknown. "After the war," she continued, "Major Fairchild helped several of us obtain immigration status. Bernadette Callahan taught me to bake with abundance, with generosity, with the assumption that there would always be enough." The reporter asked about the other women from Camp Stonehurst. "Hildegard lives in Boston. She became a nurse, working with refugees. Krista returned to Germany in 1952 to help with reconstruction. Lotta died in 1958, but before she died, she told me she was grateful for that Thanksgiving, grateful she learned the truth while there was still time to become someone different." The interview concluded, and Waltraud returned to her kitchen where new chocolate cakes cooled on racks. She had baked thousands over the years, each one a small act of remembrance and gratitude. Customers came for the taste, but for Waltraud, every cake was a prayer. A prayer of thanks for enemies who showed kindness. A prayer of repentance for the country she had served in ignorance. A prayer of hope that sweetness freely given and gratefully received could somehow balance the scales of history. The cake hadn't erased their past, but it had given them a choice, and Waltraud had chosen truth.